Well, good morning, Mr. Douglas. Um, I'm very pleased to be able to speak with you. I'm an author and have been studying very heavily into American history and the history of the fight against slavery. My name's Nancy Spannaus, and I wrote this book about a little over a year ago. Um, and as I delved into what was actually going on in the fight against slavery, which has been less covered than the horrors of slavery, of which obviously should be exposed, the what I came across, I was very fascinated with your role in the and both on the question of our form of government, but also on the question of Abraham Lincoln. And while I'm a big devotee of Abraham Lincoln, um, I find that there are lots of people today who are not. Um, and I thought it would be very useful to get your outlook on your experience with President Lincoln, your evaluation of his character and what he was able to accomplish. So um, the only other thing I would say in introduction is happy birthday 3 days in advance. And number two, uh, that we're speaking obviously on the eve of Lincoln's birthday, where a certain amount of attention will be given to him. So um, let's start with your thoughts on your friend Abraham Lincoln.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Professor Spanish.
Not
And
professor, just an author.
just an author. Well, they referred to me as a minister and esquire, and I had many roles as well that I may or may not have earned. But certainly, speaking of Mr. Lincoln, President Lincoln, and all the people that I was able to associate myself with, many like me, self-made men, and especially President Lincoln, coming from humble beginnings to the presidency. I started following President Lincoln well before he made it to the White House. I was
Oh,
following
really? Oh, really?
his his rise. I was reading uh, in the newspapers the debates, uh, news of the debates he had with Stephen A. Douglas. It seems kind of peculiar that many times when I come to the modern era, like now, many people want to know about my debates with Abraham Lincoln. I assure you, I never debated Mr. Lincoln, although I did meet him several times. That was Stephen A. Douglas with one S, the lesser Douglas. But I was reading the accounts of the debates he was having with Stephen A. Douglas. And of course, Stephen A. Douglas and he competing for the seat as Senator of Illinois. And their stance on slavery and where I might be able to find refuge as a person in bondage. And so, of course, knowing that Stephen A. Douglas um, was leaning more towards popular sovereignty. He was supporting the westward expansion of slavery based on this popular sovereignty. If they went into Kansas, and if Kansas decided, the people of Kansas decided that they would have slaves, then that would be the rule of the day. But of course, the question is, once Kansas is formed as a state, then when would that vote occur? There were many uh, settlers going out there, free soil settlers, hoping to establish their farms, and they did not want slaves. And so, were you going to have the vote after all the slaveholders arrived in Kansas? That would not be the answers that I was looking for. And so I'm reading these debates and finding where I might find refuge. And of course, now Lincoln, after the Fugitive Slave Act, after the dreadful decision by Judge Tawney and Dred Scott on Dred Scott, I had no choice but to side with the Republicans, with the radical Republicans. When I read Lincoln's speech, A House Divided,
Yeah,
that is when I realized,
that was right after the Dred Scott decision.
yes, and as a
Yes.
matter of fact, many people focus on those first pages, eloquent pages of his speech, A House Divided. But when you read on, you will find that he's literally talking about the Dred Scott decision. And I was totally upset is a moderate word for what I felt about the Dred Scott decision. And I wrote my own speech about the Dred Scott decision. And so this is when I decided to side with the radical Republicans and started supporting Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans for their nominations. I think the way that I put it is that the Republican Party was the only ship at sea in which I could feel I would not be drowned in a
Okay.
sea of bondage.
Right, right. Even though you were a free man, you were at that point, I believe, you were devoting your life to ensuring that slavery was ended in the United States, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Um, yeah, I've read those whole debates myself. It's and what I came away with is the fact that is what Abe said, President Lincoln said at the very end, which is the key issue is slavery right or is slavery wrong? And Stephen A. Douglas, while claiming that he was not either pro or anti, was nonetheless, uh, therefore, saying slavery was okay, right? Ah, there you go. Now I see you in a much clearer way. I should have pointed that out before. Who is that statue of? That's a statue of you, right?
No, this is, I am at Cedar Hill in my parlor in Anacostia in Washington, D.C. Uh, and, uh, and that is one of the many busts that I have in my house, my home. There are about 14 rooms here.
Wow.
Um, and so it's not of me, though.
Who is it?
Unless the National Park Service, I mean, of course, now after my demise, the National Park Service keeps the house and they tend to move things around.
Ah,
I
I
hardly know
see.
where things are sometimes.
Okay, okay.
Yes.
You can be forgiven for that, for not having the power to do that from where you are right now. Um,
As a matter of fact, I'm frequently wondering, what did you do with the cane that Abraham Lincoln left me?
can't find it?
Well, they tell me it's in good safekeeping. They gave me a replica to tag around with
Oh
as
my
I travel
goodness.
around in the modern era.
Oh
Imagine
wow,
that.
wow. Well, that's a little tricky here. Okay. So you followed Lincoln through the debates and decided that he was the only choice. Um, how did you think he did? I mean, we can proceed in a number of ways. I believe you met with him 3 times. That's sort of a progression, but
I did, but well before I actually finally met Mr. Lincoln, I was certainly lobbying him right at the start of the Civil War. Of course, you understand that I started out of bondage, uh, following the guidance and the teachings and the Well, with William Lord Garrison.
Correct.
You see, I met William Lord Garrison in New Bedford, Massachusetts. They asked me to join that institution of anti-slavery, and I was making speeches for them and wrote my first narrative. But the Garrisonians, of course, were Quakers, and they were nonconformists. They were non-voters. They thought that we could change the country by mere moral suasion. And
Oh,
so this was their philosophy that I had to somehow find a way to get over. And it wasn't until I read the Constitution for myself
huh.
and started realizing the true intent of the founding fathers, and how Lincoln paired up with that intent that all men would be created equal, that I finally landed with Lincoln and the Republicans. And so
You were quite a
it was,
reader, Mr.
excuse me?
Douglas. You were quite a reader, Mr. Douglas, I understand.
Oh, yes, I certainly read many books. I guess in the later years of my life, 1894, I had about 5,000 books in my library.
Wow, wow.
And so I certainly not only read books, but I read literature as well. Of course, you understand that all the great poets of the 19th century, they were speaking on the day. I certainly would probably say that a poet may be able to teach you more about history than a historian can. And so when you consider the words of Whittier and Emerson and all the great poets of those days, Francis E.W. Harper, I was reading all of these and digesting what other people had to say about the institution of slavery and the emancipation of slavery. And so I was lobbying Abraham Lincoln to, once the war started, to add Black soldiers to the fight. We sent him messages. If we were able to fight in the Revolutionary War, the Black Minutemen of Massachusetts, Crispus Attucks, the first Black man to be killed in the Revolutionary War, if we were good enough to fight alongside Washington, then why would we be not good enough to fight alongside McClellan? This
Right.
was the argument we were taking to Mr. Lincoln.
Mm-hmm.
And so, of course, him and his prudent thinking, some might say slow, eventually arrived on a decision to draft the Emancipation Proclamation. And on the first day of January 1863, my sons and I, we were in Massachusetts. And as soon as we read and digested the Emancipation Proclamation, we realized that this was give us the opportunity to fight. And so my sons straightway went to the recruiting station, and they enlisted in the 54th Infantry Division.
Oh, really? In the 54th?
And so, of course, they served in the Civil War. One became a first sergeant, the other a sergeant major. But this is what we were lobbying Abraham Lincoln all along.
Oh, see. You didn't wait for a meeting or permission for anything like that. I understand you were a terrific recruiter at that time. I've seen the posters that were put out.
Yes, we were recruiting all over the country. Even my son, Frederick Jr., is not given enough credit for all he did as well. He went out to the Mississippi Valley and recruited soldiers.
Oh, wow.
I recruited soldiers in Connecticut and New Jersey for the 29th Infantry Division of colored troops. And so we were doing our very best to recruit those colored men who wanted to show that we could fight.
Right.
But what happened and ended up on my path, directly in front of Mr. Lincoln, was that after a while, the recruitment started falling off. We couldn't get soldiers to join. And when we queried them about what that cause was, I ended up in front of Mr. Lincoln with three grievances. Firstly, that we were not getting equal pay.
That's the one I remember.
Secondly, that there were no Black officers in the ranks. And thirdly, that there seemed to be no such thing as a Black prisoner of war. any colored soldier being caught on the battlefield was immediately hung or lynched or sent back south into bondage. And so when I arrived at the White House, I'm sitting in the hall and the place is beaming with activity. And Mr. Lincoln came out of his office and saw me sitting in the hallway and told his secretary to bring me straightway into his office. And she kind of objected because the governor of Connecticut had an appointment. And of course, he was one of the most powerful governors in the Union at that time. And President Lincoln said, no, he can wait. I've been waiting to hear and meet Mr. Douglass. And so here I am now standing face to face with Abraham Lincoln to file these grievances.
Well, too bad people can't do that today. Yeah, things have changed quite a bit in the White House since your time, Mr. Douglas. The access to the president is, and actually, I believe the receptivity of the president uh, to his countrymen's complaints is rather different. Um, the So, what happened in that meeting?
Excuse me, ma'am?
What happened in that meeting?
Well, of course, as I always refer to President Lincoln as an honest boatman, he listened to and considered my questions. Excuse me, I have a cup of coffee here. And so he listened intently to my questions. On the first question, he told me that he was certainly working to ensure that colored soldiers got their equal pay, but that it would take some time because he had other factors to consider. That there were people in the Union fighting on the battlefield who thought that even though they were fighting for an end to slavery, that they thought that their work was more valuable than the colored man's work. And so he had some work to do as far as getting us equal pay. On the second cause of no black officers in the ranks, he actually called his secretary in and offered me a commission, if you can believe it or not.
Wow.
But I quickly said, well, my sons are fighting and they're of age to fight, and I am not of age to serve. And so he eventually made the first colored officer in the ranks.
Wow.
And so he followed through on that. On the third issue, lastly, he said this. He said, well, I'm certainly aware that there are war crimes going on, but I can't go indiscriminately taking revenge on Confederate soldiers. But if someone would bring me evidence that a Confederate soldier has violated the acts of war, then we can bring that person to justice. And so, how can you argue with an honest boatman like President Lincoln? And so I took this back to all of those who were helping to recruit soldiers, and we made this part of our recruiting effort of what Mr. Lincoln had told me, and things picked back up. And of course, the war was picking up momentum, and that's how that first meeting with Abraham Lincoln went.
Uh-huh. Okay. Yeah, the quote that has survived over the century since that meeting has been that that you would stress that Mr. Lincoln's approach to you was, I don't know if the first time, but at least a very strikingly one of the times when a white man would deal with you as with no consideration of the fact that you were of a different race, that he treated you just as a man, right?
Absolutely. He treated me not as chattel property, but as an equal human being. Now, but it wasn't the first. Of course, when I left New Bedford, Massachusetts, uh, and went to England, of course, the Garrisonians sent me there because the writing of my first narrative, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, got me into some unwanted attention. It became so popular that the bounty hunters, the slave catchers, realized that I was in New Bedford, and so I ended up on the RMS Cambria, sailing for Liverpool.
Uh-huh.
I was only supposed to be in Liverpool for 4 days. I ended up in Ireland for 4 months.
Wow.
And so this is right before the potato famine. And certainly those Irishmen, who I called masterless slaves, they were so impoverished at the time. And their prime minister, they treated me not as chattel property,
Right.
but as an equal human being. I certainly sat with the Prime Minister Daniel O'Connell, and he treated me just as a regular human being.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Yeah, the Irish are a major component of what's built our country, I believe. But that's a different story, a longer
Yes,
story, in terms of political economy, which is what I've more focused on.
yes.
But
And
let's,
so then the next time that I had the opportunity, I was at the second inaugural of Abraham Lincoln, uh, and uh, and I'm
isn't there
standing.
another one in between?
Well, the
I
second
thought that the
inaugural, and
second
then
one when Lincoln asked you to come in August of 1864. My understanding is he asked you to come, and he was very worried he was going to lose the election, and that he said that, I mean, this is what I read in a book. Maybe it's not
yes,
true. The that he was worried he was going to lose the election, and he asked you to accelerate the motion of of the enslaved people out of the South to the North. He says, "Why aren't more people escaping?" And
yes. I certainly remember that conversation, and there were many plans about how to facilitate that and make that happen. Some of the ideas of John Brown creeped into that conversation that we might establish a series of outposts throughout the Appalachian, about 25 miles or so apart, and they could find their way to each station and make their way safely out of bondage into to the north. And so, yes, we had that conversation, and certainly all that I could do to assist him in winning the presidency. By that time, was already living in Rochester, New York,
uh-huh.
uh, and uh, and so I had that as a residency, and I was could vote, and so I ended up being a delegate
Oh,
in New York,
oh, wow.
and was responsible for carrying the ballots from that particular county in New York to Washington D.C.
Terrific, terrific. I, you have a lot of knowledge that hasn't made it into the history books, Mr. Mr. Douglas, at least in the ones that I've read. So anyway, you were going to the second inaugural, I believe. Uh,
Yes, well, you understand we were at the inauguration. I was there with some of my friends, and not too far from where the president and the new vice president were standing. Of course, many people uh, might not know that the name Hannibal Hamlin seems to escape the books of history in your time. Everyone talks about Johnson, but nobody talks about Hamlin. But here we're standing, and President Johnson is standing close by President Lincoln. And President Lincoln sees me and my small entourage and motions that President Johnson should pay attention. And when I caught the eye of President Johnson, I suddenly realized that he was no friend of mine.
Mm.
And so that's how it went. I suddenly realized that this new vice president might have some problems if I had to deal with him.
Right, right, absolutely. And then you went to the reception, right?
Well, I went certainly intent on getting in and congratulating President Lincoln, but they stopped me at the door. And now, which I have been stopped at many doors
Yeah,
before,
I'm sure.
but certainly surprised, and just by the fact that President Lincoln was a tall man who could see over the many people crowded around him, he saw me at the door and instructed
And you were
one of
tall
his
too, right?
security.
What, you were tall too, and he could see
Yes,
you.
yes. And so he instructed them to let me in, and I went straightway to President Lincoln, and he wanted to know what I thought of his speech. And I said, "Well, Mr. Lincoln, certainly there are so many other people here that would want to have your attention than me." He said, "No, no, they can wait. I want to know what you thought of my speech." And I fumbled for some words, and I said, "President Lincoln, it was a noble effort, sir, sacred effort, sir." Yes, sir.
Right. That's that has come down. Um, I'm wondering if we can go now to one of your speeches assessing the life and accomplishments of Abraham Lincoln. Um, I believe the one that resonates strongly with me was at the memorial statue that was done in Washington, D.C., at the
Yes,
instigation of some freed slaves from the
yes,
Midwest. Um,
yes.
uh, could you give us an idea of that, of what you had to say in your assessment at that point?
Yes, well, this was April of 1875, 10 years after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And this Emancipation Monument that was erected was the winning design over others who had submitted ideas for the monument. And some of us, including myself, thought it could have been a better choice in that design. But nevertheless, it was paid for by the pennies, nickels, and dollars of colored people. And so they erected that monument with the great Archer Alexander beside Abraham Lincoln, rising out of bondage. Uh, and uh, And so here I am about to make a speech. Now, of course, all of our speeches, except for Mr. Lincoln, who could give a brief speech, I could not. But I stood and gave oration on the memory of Abraham Lincoln. Now, I don't know how much time we have left in our talk, but I could
We
give
have
you maybe.
they're warning me that we have very little time, that we have 7 minutes left.
Oh, well, in 7 minutes, I might be able to give you a taste of what I said that day.
Good, good.
Yes. Well, of course, you understand there were hundreds, but not thousands of people there. And what I said as I rose to the podium was, um, we come here um, this particular day to give honor to this great monument. We stand here today uh, to have what many people say is a noble cause. President Lincoln was our president. He was entirely devoted to the welfare of white men. Uh, you are the children of Abraham Lincoln, I said to the people. We colored people are at best our stepchildren, children by adoption, children by the forces of circumstance and necessity. For while Abraham Lincoln saved for you a country, he delivered us from a bondage. Therefore, it shall be asked what we have to do with the memory of Abraham Lincoln, or what Abraham Lincoln has to do with us. The answer is, though he loved Caesar less than Rome, though the Union was more important to him than our freedom or our future, under his wise and beneficent rule, we gradually saw ourselves lifted from the depths of slavery to the heights of liberty and manhood. Can any colored man or any white man friendly to the cause of freedom for all men ever forget the night which followed the first day of January 1863, when everyone was waiting to see the magnificence of his word? He was assailed by abolitionists. He was assailed by slaveholders. He was assailed for not making the war an abolition war. And he was bitterly assailed for making the war an abolition war. He calmly and bravely heard the voices of fear and doubt all around him. But he had an oath in heaven, and there was not power on earth to make this honest boatman violate that sacred oath. But dying as he did, by the red hand of violence, killed, assassinated, not because of personal hate, for no man who ever knew Abraham Lincoln could hate him, but because of his fidelity to union and liberty, he is doubly dear to us. So, fellow citizens, I end as I began, in doing honor to the memory of our friend and our liberator. We may kindly point to the monument erected in the memory of Abraham Lincoln.
Thank you so much. I hope that I can circulate this statement of yours, which, because that statue has been under assault, as has many other honors to Mr. Lincoln in the recent period, where people don't have the historic view that you have risen to, and therefore trivialize, I believe, the situation which the president faced. It's more like an opinion poll than
Yes.
putting a man in the situation of what, as president, are you going to do about to move these people? And as I believe you said at another point, and I have to move quickly here, but in one of your other presentations, is there's a way in which you can sort of understand why he had to go slow, because he had to bring other people along. He had to bring that white constituency, which was his major constituency, along with his decisions. And I think you indicated that if he had moved more rapidly, he might have lost them. He might have
Well, if you
lost
read
that. He might have lost that second election.
yes, if you read the context of the Emancipation Proclamation, it shows his prudence and his understanding. Many people might say, even at that time, as well as in your time, that Abraham Lincoln, by writing the Emancipation, did not free the slaves. And that partly might be true, because if you read it, he excludes the counties of St. Bernard, St. Clemens, the 48 counties of West Virginia, Norfolk, Terrebonne. Well, why did he do this? Because there were border states who still owned slaves and were fighting for the Union. And so, not to cause them to succeed right in the middle of the war, then he gave them 100 days. But of course, the Emancipation Proclamation was just the beginning. Right. It was actually the 13th and 14th Amendment that finalized the emancipation of slaves, giving them citizenship, giving them equal protection under the law. And of course, then finally, with the 15th Amendment, giving us the elective franchise.
Right.
And so this was the argument that was going on back when we were arguing over the Judge Taney decision, over the Fugitive Slave Act. that there has to be compromise. When you don't have compromise, things happen like the Judge Taney decision or the Fugitive Slave Act.
We're gonna have to close it off, I'm afraid. I hope we can have a discussion again about some other crucial issues where I believe you have a tremendous insight that will be helpful to us today. So thank you very much for your time, Mr. Douglass, and have, as I said before, a very happy birthday this year.
Thank you so much. Thank you.